Good afternoon, everybody. I am Asaf Ramarowski, the Executive Director of the Association for Middle East Studies for the Middle East and Africa, ASMIA, and it is my great pleasure to welcome you this afternoon for our latest webinar conversation. This afternoon, we have the privilege and opportunity to talk to my friend and colleague, Hussain Abdul-Hussain. Hussain is a research fellow at FDD, where he focuses on the Gulf and Yemen, including Gulf relations with Iran, and of course, Gulf peace with Israel. Hussain was born in Beirut, was born and raised in Beirut, Baghdad, and Baalbek, cities that have been theater for major Middle Eastern events. And he has a background in history and archaeology from the American University in Beirut, where he worked afterward as a reporter and then later as a managing editor at the Beirut's Daily Star. He's been covering these events for many, many years, ranging from the Lebanese border with Israel to Iraq. And in DC, he's been, a prolific writer and analyst on a lot of these issues and covering these topics in English and in Arabic. There is a lot going on, obviously, with the new brokered deal of the Chinese between when it comes to Iran and Saudi Arabia. And obviously, there's a lot to discuss. Hussain is going to give us an insight into what actually is happening, some historical background to all of these relations and where we're going forward. Housekeeping wise, we are going to do our best to get to all your questions this afternoon. I know there are many and there's a lot to discuss. If we don't get to all your questions this afternoon, please feel free to email us after the webinar. Hussain will talk for about 20 minutes and then we will go into a Q&A. So without further ado, Hussain, really thank you again for joining us, and the virtual floor is now yours.
Thank you, Asaf. Thanks, Asmaya, for having me. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. When Asaf and I first talked about this webinar, things have not happened. The recent deal between Saudi Arabia and Iran had not been signed. So we were talking totally about history. I had posted a piece about the history of Saudi Arabia, of the founding of Saudi Arabia, and how the founder, Abdulaziz ibn Saud, how he expanded and how he won or forced tribes. He beat tribes around the peninsula, and these tribes pledged allegiance to him. And to his mind, he was expanding all the way to the Levant, all the way to northern Syria, to the Mediterranean coast. So Saudi Arabia was a country that was founded in such a way that the tribes pledge allegiance to the monarch or the ruler. And in return, the ruler just reciprocates by offering all kinds of protection. First and foremost, physical protection. And second, eventually with oil, the Saudi ruling family, the Al Saud, they started offering government jobs and job security, and they give out just cash to their people, and this worked for a long time because the Saudi oil revenue was enormous and the population was relatively small. But then the population started growing and the money was not enough to go around. So Saudi Arabia meddled through. And anyone who lived in Washington over the past decades would remember that we had a few points. Whenever we discussed Saudi Arabia at the time, everyone was thinking, okay, so the leadership is aging. All these kings were brothers. We were not sure what will happen after the last brother dies, whether the same family would still be in power. So all these questions, I think, got an answer in 2015 with the accession of incumbent King Salman. And King Salman bin Abdulaziz got us with him, his son Hamad, better known as MBS. And MBS proved to be a storm in Saudi Arabia, and he turned the country upside down. First of all, he turned the ruling model from one based on tribal allegiance to the ruling family to one that's more similar to autocracy. And when he did that, he was also changing the system of sponsoring all these Saudis, using the oil money to sponsor Saudis. And instead, he's been trying to mimic the model of Dubai. Of course, we know the United Arab Emirates, Abu Dhabi and Dubai, they have oil, but they've been successful in switching, in taking their economy, in ending, or not ending it, but in decreasing the reliance on oil. Today, I think 70% of the UAE economy does not depend on oil. So MBS saw in the UAE a great example, and he's been trying to switch, to transform the Saudi economy from one that relies on oil rent and oil revenue to one that relies on trying to capture a share of the global knowledge economy. And this, of course, needs human resources. It needs Saudis with degrees, and it needs to liberalize great sectors. He had to tap into human resources, including women. Women were allowed to drive. Women became almost as equal as they can get in that part of the world to men, before the law, that is. So all these changes that have been happening, MBS, and that's what Saudi Arabia is saying. That's not only what we're saying. I mean, the Saudis are saying we're open for business. We're changing our model from old Saudi Arabia to a new Saudi Arabia that's seeking prosperity, that's seeking to wean itself out of oil. So along this model, so many policies changed, and these policies had to include at least, or still include, foreign policy. So we've seen that the UAE realized that for them to prosper as a knowledge-based economy, to capture a share of the global pie, they had to go to the zero trouble foreign policy, and they had to maintain as much good ties and bilateral trade and bilateral relations with the biggest number of countries in the region and the world. Of course, Israel, which has one of the most dynamic and most advanced economies in the region. The Israeli economy is exactly the size of the UAE economy, and both have roughly an equivalent a population of 9 to 10 million. And the UAE and Israel are the third biggest economies in the region, Saudi Arabia being the first and Turkey being the second. So the UAE realized that if they want to attract multinational corporations, they have to have peace with Israel, because no multinational would want to have its regional headquarters in Dubai when Dubai does not have access to Israel. This same corporation can have its office in Cairo or in Amman, in Egypt and Jordan, where they can have access to Israel. So the primary motive for the UAE to go to sue for peace with Israel was the economy, and that vision worked, because since Abraham Accords were signed in August of 2020 until today, trade has grown exponentially between the UAE and Israel, and the UAE has really benefited in terms of economics. Now, then comes in MBS. Now, MBS is trying to replicate the UAE model, and this means that he has entered some sort of competition with the UAE, even though they're still friends and they will remain friends. But there's this kind of competition wherein Saudi Arabia is trying to attract all these multinational corporations and regional corporations. The Saudis, I think, issued some decrees wherein they gave Saudi corporations a deadline. They gave global corporations a deadline that before the year 2025, I think, if your corporate office, if your regional headquarters have not moved to Saudi Arabia, then you will not have access to the Saudi market, which is the biggest market in the region. So what we have been observing since 2015, when MBS started taking over power in Saudi Arabia, is that Saudi Arabia is changing drastically. It's the model of the economy of Saudi Arabia mandates that the Saudis will eventually go into peace with Israel. And along these lines, we saw that the Saudis opened their skies to all international air carriers, including the Israeli airlines. So all of this is part of Saudi Arabia trying to become economically attractive, trying to build an economy that's not dependent on oil. So, and along these lines, we expected, or at least I expected, the Saudis to eventually find themselves shaking hands with the Israelis, signing bilateral peace, regardless of what happens between the Palestinians and the Israelis, or regardless what happens between any Arab and the Israelis. And along these lines, many, including myself, were surprised when we woke up this past Sunday and saw the Saudis shaking hands with the Iranians instead. Now, and this happened, of course, if you've watched the news, this happened in China, where the Chinese were bragging that now they're the new brokers of diplomacy in the region, that they're taking over the role that has so far been the role of the United States over the past few decades. So what's in that deal? I've been trying hard to find out. This morning, a Saudi source told a Saudi channel that what's in the deal remains a secret because it's confidential for some reason. But by looking up all the interviews that Saudi officials gave, including an interview by their foreign minister, Faisal bin Farhan, there doesn't seem to be much. You'd expect to find some agreement over Yemen, the main point of contention between Iran, that sponsors the Houthis, and the Houthis who lob missiles and throw missiles on Saudi Arabia and the UAE and the rest of the Gulf. So you'd expect to have some sort of agreement over Yemen, over the Houthis, to end the war in Yemen, which would be in the interest of Saudi Arabia, which is trying, as we said, to have zero problems in the region and for the sake of its economy. So Yemen so far doesn't seem to be part of the discussion. Lebanon is not part of the discussion. And how do we know that? We know that because after the deal was signed on Sunday, the Iranian national currency appreciated facing the dollar. It went up. It's been going down for the past year or so. But the Lebanese lira, the Lebanese currency, kept on falling facing the dollar. And this gives you the idea that no one thinks that no one, in terms of investors, think that Lebanon is really connected to whatever is unfolding between the Saudis and the Iranians. And the reason why no one thinks that is because Saudi Arabia has given up on Lebanon at least since 2018 or 2019. The Saudis decided, okay, Lebanon is in the pocket of Iran. Hezbollah dominates Lebanon and rules every inch of it. So it's there's no reason to keep on throwing good money after bad money. And Saudi Arabia stopped investing in Lebanon or supporting Lebanon. And until then, the Saudis had been the biggest sponsors. So, for example, after the Hezbollah war with Israel in 2006, and all the destruction that Lebanon at large suffered, the Saudis stepped up. They deposited $500 million in the Lebanese central bank. They sponsored the rebuilding of infrastructure, of bridges, of many areas that the Lebanese wouldn't have afforded to build. So the Saudis, until 2018 or 2019, they were the biggest sponsors and supporters of Lebanon. MBS then decided there's no point, of course, thinking as the businessman as he looks to be thinking. He said this is a bad investment, so he folded. So Lebanon is not part of the deal so far. Yemen is not part of the deal. Iraq doesn't look like Iraq has to be part of the deal because Iraq is not under the thumb of Iran like Lebanon is or like Yemen is. Iraq, the reason why Iraq is not under Iran's control is because Iraq is the second biggest exporter of oil in the OPEC group after Saudi Arabia, with roughly 4 million barrels of oil a day. This means that the revenue of the Iraqi treasury, roughly $10 billion a month, with a surplus of $4 billion a month. This means that Iraq is much wealthier than Iran. And one of the ways that Iranians have sponsored Hezbollah is that Lebanon doesn't have resources and Iran can afford to prop up Hezbollah. This is different in Iraq. Iraq has money more than Iran. Iraq also has the Shia authority, a more senior Shia authority than Iran. And Iraq happens to have a long history facing the Iranians. There's some sort of Iraqi nationalism that's missing in Lebanon. So Iraq is not really in Iran's pocket, and it's not very close to Saudi Arabia, like Lebanon used to be close to Saudi Arabia. So Iraq is some sort in between. And of course, we have to keep in mind that we, the United States, we have roughly 2,000 to 3,000 military advisors, a residual force that President Obama at the time, when he withdrew the troops in 2011, he refused to keep that force. But then after 2014, reality forced him to keep a residual force. So anyway, so the US also has some connections with Iraq. So Iraq is not really on the table. So until this minute, I'm trying to understand, other than going back to the situation that ruled the relationship between Saudi Arabia and Iran, and they had diplomatic relations until January 2016, when the Iranians burned down the Saudi embassy in Riyadh and the consulate in Mashhad. And the Iranians did that because to respond to Saudi execution of a cleric who was opposing the Saudi government. So other than going back to December 2015 in terms of restoring diplomatic ties, what exactly do these countries have these two countries, Saudi Arabia and Iran, agreed on? And when you read the Iranian media, you will just you'll feel that the Iranians think that Saudi Arabia has completely abandoned the US and the Western camp and joined the Iran, Russia, and China camp, to the extent that Rahim Safawi, who is now the top aide of Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei, who used to be also the chief of the IRGC, Rahim Safawi said that Russia and China are thinking of inviting Saudi Arabia to join the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. So according to the Iranian media, Saudi Arabia conceded, abandoned the US, joined China, Russia, and Iran, and that's the victory that Iran has achieved. Things don't look this way from the Saudi lens. If you scan the Saudi media, this is a different thing. Now, if you try to gauge the Saudi opinion of why they did this and what this means to their friendship and alliance to the United States, and I've also talked to a few Saudi friends about this. The Saudis said, okay, this is what you wanted. This is what you guys in Washington wanted. The national security strategy that was issued in January this year said that the United States is not going to use military force in the Gulf, almost not going to use it whatsoever. The only tool that the US will use is diplomacy. Military force was reserved to defending the US homeland. So there's no military security guarantees offered to Saudi Arabia. And then again, last month, a delegation from the State Department and the Department of Defense here in the US traveled to Saudi Arabia. They held working groups meetings with GCC countries. And if you look up the statement that they issued, it just reiterated the idea that we only offer Iran diplomacy, so there's no military option at the table. And if you look up the GCC working group statement, you will find that this time diplomacy was extended to cover Iran's destabilizing activity, which includes the militias. So now we're not talking about diplomacy with Iran over the nuclear stuff only. We're talking about diplomacy with Iran over militias. So if you're Saudi Arabia and you're relying on the US to defend you, and then the US never came to your defense, regardless of who's in the White House. In 2019, when President Trump was in the White House, Saudi Arabia was hit. The Abu Qaiq oil facility was hit in 2019, and our assessment, which is public, the U.S. administration's assessment, was that these missiles and drones came from the north, i.e., from Iran. And President Trump didn't respond. He ordered the military to stand down, and it was locked and loaded and ready to respond. So there was no response in 2019. This administration has made it clear that if there's any sort of entanglement with Iran, the US is not willing to use its military force. So if you're Saudi Arabia and you're looking at what we're saying and you think, okay, if diplomacy is the only thing, so that's diplomacy. My final remark here before we go to Q&A is that Does this mean that Saudi Arabia has really abandoned the Western camp and the US? I tend to say no. And the reason why I say that is because the biggest China demand, the biggest Chinese demand to Saudi Arabia, and this was public in December, this past December when Chinese President Xi visited Saudi Arabia, the biggest Chinese demand is to denominate the sale of Saudi oil to China, which is 2 million barrels a day, a sizable chunk, in the Chinese currency, the yuan. And up until this minute, the Saudis have refused, and they've insisted that all their oil sales to China remain denominated in the US dollar. And this tells you that the theatrics aside and the photo ops aside, Saudi Arabia still bets on the US dollar, still bets on America. Now, yesterday, of course, there was another statement wherein Saudi Arabia announced that it was going to buy 300 billion worth of aircrafts from Boeing. So these signals indicate that Saudi Arabia is still not has still not parted ways with the U.S. And such a deal with Iran actually gives Saudi Arabia the leeway, if it intends to, the leeway to sue for peace with Israel and go for normalization with Israel. If the Saudis ever go for peace with Israel for the sake of their economy and their national interest, if they go for peace with Israel without the Palestinians, the last thing they need is to have an antagonistic Iran coming after them, and the Iranian media and the Iranian instigation against Saudi Arabia around the region. So the last thing they need is to have Iran come after them. So by doing so, now Iran is neutral, and this gives Saudi Arabia a much bigger space to sue for peace of Israel. That is, if the Saudis finally decide to do so. And with this, I'll just open it up to Q&A.
Great. Thank you, Hussain, for that in-depth analysis and unpacking all of this. There's obviously a lot to discuss. As Hussain mentioned, the floor is now open for questions, so feel free to tap your questions, write your questions into the chat, and we will tackle them. I'm going to give Alex the first question, and we'll take it from there. Alex, please go ahead.
Sure. Well, thanks very much, first of all, for a very wide-ranging presentation. And that is, I should say, quite sober compared to many of the analyses that have been coming out from all sides, from the U.S. and Israeli sources in particular. But I want to get at one issue in particular. I think you laid out the Saudi logic quite nicely. It's a question of looking after Saudi interests and hedging and making it clear that their ultimate goal or ultimate desire, one might say, is to remain allied with the U.S. And the Boeing deal, the report prior to the Chinese brokered agreement about laying out conditions for normalizing with Israel, which had to do with security assurances, with nuclear technology transfers, things like that. But from the other side, from the American side, the perspective is completely perplexing. You had President Biden himself coming in and calling MBS a pariah. That set the tone for the entire administration. And as of yesterday or today, you have two senators, one Republican, one Democrat, Chris Murphy and Mike Lee, introducing a resolution demanding that the State Department conduct a human rights assessment of Saudi Arabia with the potential or desired outcome of really downgrading relations even further. What's the American logic? What's the administration logic? And where is this hostility towards Saudi Arabia in general coming from on the part primarily of Democrats, but also of Republicans?
Well, it's a mix of many things. And so often you would see that points that have been cited against Saudi Arabia really don't make sense. So, for example, the 9/11 issue, the idea that Saudi Arabia funded one or more of the 19 terrorists on 9/11. That idea, even if true, which I don't think was true, but even if that idea was true, what you have in MBS now is the complete opposite of whatever used to be governing or ruling Saudi Arabia at the time. At the time, Saudi Arabia perceived of itself as an Islamic country, as the leader of the Islamic world. Not anymore. I don't think the Saudis now perceive of themselves as such. I think the Saudis now are switching to the Saudi first policy, wherein we care about our national interests and our economy, and we'll do everything it takes to serve them. I'm not sure where this antagonism in the US still comes from. Now, in the case of Senator Murphy, in February 2021, he published a long article in Foreign Affairs. And in that article, he argued against the Carter Doctrine. And for those who don't know, Carter Doctrine was the quick American intervention to protect the energy sources in the Gulf. And this happened around 1979 when the Shah regime was collapsing, and the US was scared that this might invite the Soviets to push all the way to the Gulf, and that will threaten our sources of energy. So Senator Murphy thinks that we should kill the Carter Doctrine, and he thinks, or he writes that he thinks that there's nothing that our Gulf allies can do. And he even says, call the bluff of the Emiratis, the Bahrainis, and the Saudis by stopping to arm them, by ending the Carter Doctrine, because they have nowhere else to go. They have no other options. And I'm quoting, he says they have no other options. So in a sense, what you saw on Sunday in Beijing was direct response to Senator Murphy. Okay, we have no options. We're going to China. If you're not going to offer us security, now we're shopping for security in China. And mind you that if the Saudis play this right in terms of their security, now if Iran attacks Saudi Arabia, the Saudis can take it up with the Chinese and say, hey, listen, your signature is on this document. If it counts for anything, you have to reign in Iran. And Iran last year or the year before signed an economic agreement of 25 years with China. So Iran technically relies completely on China in terms of economics and even diplomacy to an extent. So now the Saudis are thinking, okay, if we befriend the Chinese and Chinese can reign in Iran, and mind you, any alliance with the Chinese, if we push them all the way to ally with the Chinese and the Russians, this kind of alliance doesn't come with any kinds of strings attached on issues of human rights or other demands that we usually have. So what Senator Murphy is doing here is that we are upping the ante. We are pushing our allies away from us, and we're not demanding that our enemies. We've been begging Iran to talk to us over the past 2 years without regard to any human rights, even if Iran holds 3 or more US citizens as captives in its prison. We're willing to give the Iranians to release billions of dollars in frozen Iranian money just to get our hostages back. No questions asked, nothing about human rights. But when it comes to Saudi Arabia, when it comes to any one of our allies, we have the strict way of dealing with it. Okay, if you want to be our allies, you have to be exactly like us. So to this idea that when we deal with our allies, they have to look exactly in our image, I think either we're willing to go and make nations in our image and build nations like we tried to do in Iraq and Afghanistan and failed, or we have to deal with our allies the way they come. They come in all sizes and shapes, autocracies, democracies, something in between. The way we deal with them is that, okay, whoever is our friend, and whoever is not, then we'll have to treat them as enemies. So I think Senator Murphy here has, some unclear idea of foreign policy. I think he just puts up a bunch of talking points that he's picked up from friends and allies in Washington and otherwise. And it beats me. I mean, the wisdom behind this really beats me.
Great, thank you for that. Alex, we're going to go a follow-up. I'm going to go to the audience.
No, very good. Very good. Thanks very much then.
Great. Suzanne, you want to start taking the questions from the audience?
Absolutely. Okay, we have a question here from ASMEA member Professor Wayne Bowen, and he writes, does the makeup of the current Israeli government diminish the likelihood of a peace and trade deal between Israel and Saudi Arabia?
Well, I mean, I'm not the expert on domestic Israeli politics, but how does this affect Saudi Arabia? By and large, my observation is that the Saudis tend to trust governments that are to the right of the aisle, of the political aisle, than to the left. And this is not because they pick and choose. That's because for the main reason behind this is that the left and the global South look at Saudi Arabia, or especially at the Saudi government, as a government that's not worthy of its wealth. They think that the Saudis have stolen this wealth from someone, that they don't deserve it, that they should spread the wealth across populations of the world or something. And this has put the Saudis in alliance with the global North, if such a term exists. And they've been always, the relationship with left of center governments, whether in the US or in Israel or anywhere else, has not been as good. So this said, it does not mean that the government before this one in Israel, government of Yair Lapid, would have not signed peace with the Saudis, or that the Saudis would have not opted for peace. But this is just to say that when the Saudis decide to sue for peace, I don't think the composition of any government in Israel or elsewhere would be how they approach these things. I think the way they'll approach it is that, first of all, they'll have to think of the cost and the benefit. And I've explained this over the past half an hour. The cost and benefit at this point is for the Saudis to move for a deal. Now, will they want to wait until Ramadan is over? But Ramadan comes every year. Will they want to wait for some improvement for the Palestinians? What happens if Mahmoud Abbas dies? There'll be no one to talk to the Israelis after him to an extent. So these are all open questions. What I've seen from many Saudi pundits is that they are ready for bilateral peace. And what we've seen from MBS is that wherever he had losing investments, he gave up on them. Like we said in Lebanon, he just said, okay, bye-bye Lebanon, we're not interested. And he can do the same with the Palestinians any minute. When will he decide to do that? Before this deal, we saw in the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal that the Saudis were willing to go for peace, regardless of Palestinians, but they wanted a price from the US. And that price included maybe a nuclear reactor, maybe spelling out what security guarantees Washington can offer them. So I think they're willing. It depends on the price.
Okay. We have a question here. It's a little difficult to, I think there might be some typos, but it's from Ruwan Al-Rahole. And he says, thank you, Hussain. At what level stage we in the US should worry about KSA / the Gulf is actually ditching the West camp for China?
Well, the Saudis tend to hedge, and I think they understand that the Washington is like a pendulum, unfortunately so, and that when a Republican administration comes back, they'll be in a much better place. And so they understand that the current foreign policy team, which was the same foreign policy team under President Obama and the same foreign policy team under President Clinton, and probably that's one of the weaknesses of our foreign policy, is that even though we have a democracy, but the people who are making it are just going through the revolving door thing. So I think the Saudis understand that Washington will not be always as antagonistic. And mind you, they understand Washington, and they understand that if a senator here or there just tries a legislation or whatever they say or put out statements, they don't really, these things don't bother them. They understand Washington. When should we be worried is that if the Saudis come to the conclusion that Washington is a losing case, Republican or Democrat, they might want to start accepting some sort of barter over the oil that they're selling to the Chinese. Now, mind you, the next day after the deal was signed, Abdulrahman al-Rashid, who's one of the top columnists in Saudi Arabia, very well informed, in his column, he argued that Saudi Arabia is selling to China 2 million barrels a day, and this number is on the rise. Saudi Arabia is selling 300,000 barrels of oil to the United States a day, and that number is on the decline. He also said that the United States imports 50% of its energy needs from Canada. So in a way, the US doesn't need Saudi Arabia. China needs Saudi Arabia. And if that's the case, what we see is that we might see the same factors that brought together the United States and Saudi Arabia in 1945 in that famous meeting between FDR and King Abdulaziz. This same idea might be replicated between China and Saudi Arabia. Now, the only thing about Saudi Arabia is that they're really not big fans of China. They understand that China doesn't have a global currency. They understand that China is an autocracy and that it doesn't have the technology. So there are so many things that the Saudis want from the US. There's so many things that they want to import our technology. They enjoy importing our technology and our friendship and our partnership. What they don't like is that US foreign policy tends to be inconsistent, whereas you deal with China, you know what you're getting, even though you're not getting much. And in this case, I think, and Abdulrahman Rashid wrote this in his article, he said, if a tanker now gets hit in the Gulf, if a Saudi oil tanker gets hit in the Gulf, this tanker is China's problem because it's taking the oil to China. It's not America's problem. So the Saudis understand that we're not as invested in the security of that part of the world as a source of energy. But the Saudis still want to be partners in the global economy. They want to capture, like we said at the beginning, they want to capture a part of the global pie. They want to be part of the technology revolution, of the services industry, of the global tourism that they're trying to sell. So as long as this is the case, I think they'll keep an eye. They'll stay with the West. They want to keep the dollar and the finance. They want to stay plugged to the global financial system. But that part that's connected to security, Iran, and the security of the Gulf, I think that part now they're thinking of seriously switching to a more reliable China.
Good answer. Thank you. Okay, so just want to remind everybody, if you have a question for Hussain, please type it into the Q&A and we will do our best to get to your question. So we have a question here from Carol and Chuck Feynman, and they write, what happened with the murder of Jamal Khashoggi by the Saudis in 2018?
Oh, that's the question. What happened?
Yes, that's the question.
Okay.
What and why? What and why did it happen?
Okay, so first of all, let me say it was a horrible crime. Whatever happened, to start with, it's nothing that anyone should agree to or accept. What's happened? So Jamal Khashoggi was part of the old regime in Saudi Arabia. He was very close to the old regime. He was very close to the former director of the Saudi intelligence, Turki al-Faisal. And it seems that Jamal didn't get the memo that the old guard was being escorted out and now there's a new sheriff in town. So whereas everyone, including his old boss, Turki al-Faisal, just went away, faded away. I mean, they still have their public image, but they're not, they don't decide on anything in the kingdom anymore. So whereas most of these people understood that now there have beens, I think he did not get the memo. And what he did was that he tried to defy the new rule. And to an extent, he relied on Qatar, which was at the time one of the biggest rivals of Saudi Arabia. and the Washington Post, which of course we all know that he used to write for them from time to time, and the Washington Post comprehensively covered how the crime happened, the horrible scene in Turkey that took place in Turkey. The Washington Post also noted that Khashoggi's columns were edited and shaped by the then heads of Qatar Foundation here in Washington. So this didn't sit well with the Saudi government. Now, who gave the order? This is something really we can never prove. I mean, it could have been MBS. It could have been someone who's of a lower rank. But to my knowledge, when these things happen, I think most of the time, intel and security organs try not to cover their tracks as much, because most of the time, this is also a message to other dissidents that, okay, you think you're strong, this is what will happen to you. Just look what's happened. And we've seen this happen and unfold, and how Putin treats his dissidents in across Europe, or pick any other non-democracy, and you can see how they treat the dissidents. So Khashoggi was not the first dissident. I personally knew the guy, and I regret his death in 2009. Saudi Arabia decided to change policy on Syria. So if you're familiar with the Syria policy, in 2005, Syria was accused of participating in the assassination of Lebanese Prime Minister Rafiq Hariri, and Syria suffered international isolation. And then when President Obama came to power in 2009, he started the Let's Engage Syria policy. And the Saudi decided, okay, if the Americans are talking to Syria, then we can't be the only ones not talking to Syria. So late King Abdullah of Saudi Arabia visited Damascus, and of course, again, he used this the same premise that's being peddled today as I speak, that we can peel away Syria from Iran, convince the Syrians that they're Arabs and the Iranians are Persians, and we can get them away and we can win them over, which I think never worked and will never work. But anyway, this was unfolding in 2009, and people like me put against it, and people like Khashoggi reached to people like me saying, okay, guys, you have to be realistic now. Forget the justice over the Hariri tribunal. Now we have to be realistic. We have to have an Arab front against Iran. So this is just not to say that Khashoggi was a bad person or deserved death or anything. I'm just saying he was part of this unfolding game, and unfortunately, I think he miscalculated.
Okay, this is a question from Efrat Aviv, and she writes, what is your position regarding the warming of Saudi and Turkish relations?
I'll go back to what Abdurrahman Rashid wrote. I think he noted that 6 months ago, Turkey was in conflict with all the countries of the region, and now Turkey is not in conflict with anyone. Now it's at peace with all these capitals around the region. So this zero problem policy that Turkey used to have and then abandoned and now restored, and Abdurrahman al-Rashid connects this to the economy of Turkey. He said when the Turks were fighting with everyone, they had a really lousy and bad economy, but now they're friends with everyone and the economy is back to growing and prospering again. So this kind of thinking is, I think, what the Saudis are going for these days. Now they're thinking, okay, if we go for the zero problem policy, we're friends with China, with Iran, with Turkey, and have a big bilateral trade. So they're thinking of having countries. In my Turkey is at peace with Israel. And this populism that you hear from the Palestinians or all of this is just pure populism, because there's intel cooperation. The Turks worked with the Israelis to preempt attempts of Iranians to avenge what they think are Israeli attacks inside of Iran. So they were trying to go after Israeli tourists in Turkey. The Turkish intelligence worked with the Israelis to preempt these possible attacks. So Erdogan says one thing in public, but in private, he's okay with Israel. So now Erdogan, who's okay with everyone, now he looks at his economy, and its economy is back to doing okay and probably growing. I think the Saudis are thinking the same. Okay, we've had our bad times with the Turks, but now let's go to zero problems. Let's talk to the Turks. Let's talk to the Iranians, and this is what makes me think that now is prime time for them to sue for peace with Israel, whether they'll ever decide to do it or not.
Terrific. Okay, there's a question from William Geller, and he writes, what implications do you think the Saudi rapprochement with Iran could have for its potential cooperation with a future Israeli strike on Iran's nuclear facilities?
Okay, so for the answer for this question is, again, to look at the UAE and its policy as a guide. And the UAE in December of 2021 received former Israeli Prime Minister Bennett, and 2 weeks before they received the Israeli Prime Minister, the number 3 in command in the UAE, Sheikh Tahnoun bin Zayed, visited Iran and met with all senior Iranian leaders, including the president. So this is how it works. If you want to zero your problems with your neighbors, you just try to make sure that you're okay with Iran, while at the same time you're okay with Israel. And I expect if and by the way, the UAE, the reason the UAE did this also was that they thought that Israel might strike, and if Israel might strike, they told the Iranians, if there's a strike, we're not part of it. So we don't want to be on the receiving end of a reaction. So I think this is the same way that guides the Saudi policy, the regional policy, that in case they ever go for peace with Israel and Israel strikes Iran, they will tell the Saudis, we're not part of this. We're not part of this strike. We will not support this strike, and we don't want to be part of the reaction to the strike. But of course, I think if this happens, privately they'll be cheering for it. One more note about this UAE, Iran, Israeli triangulation. After Sheikh Tahnoun visited Tehran in December, in January, the Houthis, the Iranian militia in Yemen, struck Abu Dhabi and Dubai using ballistic missiles and explosive drones. And I think they did it 2 or 3 times. And this should tell you the extent of commitment that Iran gives to other people. So they give you a commitment to do one thing, and the month after they just changed their minds. And this takes us back to JCPOA. After it was signed, and John Kerry said this brings peace to the region, 3 months after that, they started experimenting with ballistic missiles, which really embarrassed the Obama administration and John Kerry. And the same applies to Lebanon. In October, Nasrallah was praising the agreement over the sea border between them. And this past week, we've seen a terrorist from Hezbollah infiltrate across the border, go to Israel, detonate a bomb, and he was killed, but he had a suicide vest on him. So you're thinking, okay, so in October, U.S. State Department was praising its own diplomacy, saying that, look, we brought peace using diplomacy, and this only, 5 months later, we're dealing with a possible war between Hezbollah and Israel. So one thing about deals with Iran and Hezbollah is that they rarely tend to stick.
Thank you. Okay, here's a question from Ayad Rahim, and he writes, how about inside Saudi Arabia? What's the balance of power internally? Wahhabis, Shias, modernizers, liberalizers, etc.
Well, I think with MBS, he's moving to liberalize most of the country. I'm not saying he's abandoning Islam, but he's just taking Islam out of the public life, out of politics. And I know that we're all angry at what Saudi did to Khashoggi, but at the same time, Saudi went after all these hateful preachers, and some of them just were thrown in prison, some of them were fined. Some of them were asked to stop tweeting or talking. So MBS did a huge job in curbing political Islam, in curbing Islamism, and that's one of the huge things that happened in the region. So now what we see, I mean, the other day I was watching footage from Saudi Arabia of a random concert, and I looked at the audience, most of which were Saudis, and 70% of the women did not have a hijab on. And I was really surprised, because if you get the same footage, a similar footage from Egypt, the 70% of the women would be you'd see them with a hijab on. So things are moving in Saudi Arabia in a liberal direction, and I think when things start moving this way, the lines of cleavage between Shia, Wahhabi, Yemeni, Saudi, Northern, Southern, Najdi versus Hijazi, all these cleavages that we know about Saudi Arabia tend to disappear. And I said that what MBS is trying to do is he's promoting Saudi first policy, national interest first, patriotism. And when these policies start dominating, I think that the other policies would recede, because even if you're Shia Saudi, you will get a piece of the pie, because the way MBS is imagining this is that this is a country that be based on meritocracy. So who cares if you're from this tribe or that tribe, or if you're Shia, or if you're Najdi or Hijazi.
A slightly related question here from Carl Goldberg. He writes, you said that the Saudis are no longer as concerned about being leaders of the Islamic world as previously. This sounds revolutionary, considering that the Saudis are still the keepers of the two holy cities and the destination of the Hajj. Please describe the resistance which MBS must be getting from the rest of the Sunni Muslim world.
Well, I mean, the resistance comes mainly from the camp that's being led by Qatar, even though now he's ended the rivalry with Qatar, even though they're, privately they're not happy about their friendship. I mean, but publicly they've managed to become civil. So Qatar and the Muslim Brotherhood, they're totally against what MBS is doing in terms of going against Islamism. They're still the host of the two holy shrines, that's for sure. But if you look up the Vision 2030, if you look up Saudi economic pundits, you will see that they're thinking of this, the Hajj, the annual Hajj issue is how to expand Hajj from 9 million, I think, a year to 25 million. They're thinking of Hajj as a point of tourist attraction, as a point of big revenue for the state. So they're not using this anymore as their credentials of being the leaders of the Muslim world or being the leaders of the Arab world. They're thinking of this as, and some of you might remember during the early days when MBS came to power, The Economist ran a piece about him wherein they said he has some monitors in front of him that show all the indicators of economics and corruption and red tape. So if this is actually his thinking, then it makes sense that they're thinking of all of this in terms of revenue. One thing to add here, the spot where MBS is trying to move his capital, the new city of Neom, is the northwest of Saudi Arabia. And this is one of the most beautiful archaeologic parts of Saudi Arabia. If you know the Wahhabi Islam, it was prohibited under Wahhabi Islam to go to these areas because they interpreted Quran in such a way that the people who used to live here, God cast a spell on them and they died because they didn't listen to God. So these were considered to be cursed spots, and no one would go visit them. And now, by the mere fact that MBS decided to promote this huge tourist attraction, this goes against the grain of every Islamist thinking at the time. So this is to say that he is doing a huge job in pushing back against Islamism, eradicating Islamism, and like I said, Hajj as a tourist attraction, Northwest Arabia as a tourist attraction, and eventually he will need to get some tourism from and to Israel.
Okay, so I'm gonna combine these two questions here because they're related. And then someone also asks if you can provide the Al-Rashid article that you continue to draw from. So we can certainly send out that link after the webinar for people who are interested. Okay, so this is these are two questions that are similar. So how does the new arrangement between Saudi and Iran affect relations between Israel and Saudi? Will this relationship continue to grow? And does Israel need Saudi as a close ally?
Israel needs Saudi as a close ally. If we're thinking of national interest, and Saudi being the biggest market and the biggest economy in the region, it's certainly not positive to have peace with the Saudis, Israeli peace with the Saudis. One thing that I tend to tell my Israeli friends is that if you get peace with MBS, this is not the peace that the past generations used to think of. You're not getting peace with the leader of the Muslim world. You're not getting peace with a person who speaks on behalf of Palestinians. You're getting bilateral peace with the Saudi state, just one-on-one peace. And I think this is how the UAE has managed its peace. And by the way, I mean, this is how allied and friendly countries deal with one another. So they have peace, they have bilateral trade, they have strong diplomatic ties, but at the same time, they disagree on things. We disagree with the Europeans all the time, and Europeans disagree with one another all the time. So we should expect disagreements. I mean, the UAE still disagrees with Israel over issues connected to Jerusalem or, some Palestinian issues. This does not mean that the UAE is not happy with their peace, or they're not growing it or supporting it, or, making sure that it's on a people-to-people level. So I think if the Saudis go for peace with Israel, the Iranians will not make a big issue out of it. If the Iranians are getting what they want, in this case, they get Yemen and they have Lebanon already in their pocket. And look, the Iranians still have strong ties with the UAE, even though the UAE is one of the best friends of Israel in the region, so to speak.
Okay, I think we're going to, because we're just at noon or just at 1, so I'm going to toss it back to Asaf.
Great. Well, thank you, Suzanne. Hussain, really, thank you for that sobering analysis and for taking the time to unpack everything. There's obviously a lot to talk about, and I know you're coming out with a future article on some of these topics, so please make sure to send it to us and we'll be able to circulate it as well. Obviously, I want to thank everybody for joining us this afternoon. Be on the lookout for future webinars. We do our best to showcase many of our friends and colleagues, including people like Hussain, who are presenting at our conferences, and so there's a lot to talk about and a lot to unpack here. So again, Hussain, I want to thank you for taking the time this afternoon. Please keep us on your radar for coming back. I want to thank, as always, my colleagues, Emily, Suzanne, and Alex, for joining me, and of course everybody who came to join us this afternoon. And be on the lookout for future webinars, and we will continue the conversation very shortly. So everybody have a good day, and we will talk soon.
Thank you.